Good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us tonight for our Southeast Uplifts Back to Basics workshop. Tonight's topic is on meeting facilitation skills to build a community. I'm Machi Williams. I'm the neighborhood planner and liaison manager at Southeast Uplift. I'm joined here tonight with my colleague, Alex.
My name is Alex Sharon. I'm the Partnerships and Grant Making Programs Manager.
And at Southeast Uplift, we're an independent nonprofit established in 1968 that builds grassroots civic engagement and fosters community involvement through our various programs and initiatives. We emphasize relationship building, grassroots democracy, sharing, teaching, learning, diversity, inclusiveness, capacity building in the community. So the Back to Basics is a pilot workshop series to build the capacity of community groups to consciously engage in civic matters through a series of trainings and workshops. Upon completion of the series, participants will have a foundation of skills and knowledge and tools to engage in community advocacy. A little bit of housekeeping. Also, if you want to enable captionings, please, in the Zoom client, go down to the More or Settings option and click the three ellipses and then click on Captions. Some of the goals of our Back to Basics tonight is how to find common ground on divisive topics by navigating complex conversations and application of meeting facilitation skills.
Also to promote equity and accessibility in event planning, meetings, and communications.
Build trust and respect within our community while challenging conventional ways of thinking and implicit bias.
And to weave family narratives and local history into local planning processes.
And strengthen relationships using trauma-informed communications to build social connections in your community. So here are the dates where you can sign up for additional trainings. We'll have them throughout all of April. Just go to southeastuplift.org/events, and you can find more information on how to sign up for these workshops happening in the series. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce your presenter tonight, Andrea Emerson, who will be guiding us through meeting facilitation skills to build community.
Thank you so much, Machu and Alex. It is delightful to be here with you. It is possible that we'll have some additional folks joining us throughout these just first few minutes. So if that happens, we will welcome them in. Not a problem, but glad you can be with us tonight. I wanted to start before we dive into content. Well, first, actually, before I introduce myself, let me just give you a little heads up of what to expect. This is going to be somewhat interactive. So I've tried to give us a mix of content that we can interact with, as well as space to practice some of the skills that we'll explore together. And so just to prepare for that, you're welcome to interact at your comfort level. So, and if you're more comfortable, for instance, if I open up for a question to the group and you feel more comfortable typing something in the chat versus coming off of mute, that's absolutely fine. So we'll try to just balance that as we move through the content together. But again, thanks for being here. So before we dive into the topic, I wanted to share a little bit about my family story and what makes this a topic that I really care about and get excited about. Because at its core, it's about how do we navigate differences, and that perhaps we might describe them as things that hit as like deep differences. But the reality is any two people, any one other human that you encounter at any given point in your life or day, you're going to hit a point where you realize a way that you're different. And sometimes those differences lead to tension. So I think if we can practice the skills in lower stakes settings that we want to bring to conversations and spaces where the stakes feel like they're higher, that's the skill building around how do we navigate these conversations. So I say two things. It's understanding and normalizing difference can lead to conflict and tension, and just expecting that that's just part of the human experience. And then it's, are there other places where we can practice these skills, again, where the stakes feel a little lower, so that when we get to higher stakes conversations, we feel prepared. So a little about what brings me to this work. I like to think about it through the lens of my two of my great grandmothers who are on the screen before you. One of my great grandmothers is from what is now known as South Korea. When I think about her lived experience in the world, she survived the colonization of the Korean Peninsula by Imperial Japan at the time. So she survived that experience, and then survived the decimation of that peninsula through the Korean War. So that's some of her lived experience in the world. And then on the other side of the screen is another one of my great grandmothers. So my great grandmother from Korea is on my dad's side of the family. My great grandmother from my mom's side of the family is on the other side of the screen. She was raised in Kansas, a couple of generations removed from the immigrant experience, but also by default of where her family came from in Europe, was able to more easily assimilate into dominant American culture. So I carry those two strands of experience in my sense of identity. And growing up, I felt like I got a front row view to watch what happens when two people who come from very different perspectives, very different communication styles, and even underlying values, how do they negotiate those differences? And I sometimes joke that I saw the good, the bad, and the neutral of that process, but it gave me a front row seat to think about, how do we navigate difference? How do we navigate conversations where the stakes are high around our differences? So what I would like to do is hear a bit from those of you who are here. Again, you can share via the chat, or you can come off mute. And the question I want to ask, it's on the next screen, is what are some of the complexities? I shared a bit of the complexity that I show up in any space with. What are some of the complexities that you've noticed among the groups that you're facilitating meetings for, or any kind of gatherings? What are you noticing in terms of challenges or tension points, or how you would define complexity? So again, full permission if you want to. Oh, I see Katie jumped off mute.
Click, click, click. Okay, hey.
Hey.
Hey, it's because it's covered by a privacy post-it note. There we go. There we go. So I work with the city and the county, and the city's values and their services are aligned in a certain way that tends to gravitate more towards law and order. And and then the county's is very social services focused, and then that means they have more of a softer approach to everything, and very focused on like harm reduction, which just comes across culturally in all the different ways that they facilitate work. And so they kind of move at different speeds.
Yeah.
And that's like direct versus indirect communication. It's everything at all levels. It's the type of people that gravitate towards that work, and then we're working together during emergencies. So high stress, high pressure.
Yeah. And then that urgency piece, I can just imagine in my head, I have like, oh, I can think of all sorts of scenarios where that you'd hit that tension point, or that conflict around communication styles and preferences, and even values of how to approach the work. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Katie. That's a great kickoff. And someone always has to give the gift of going first. So you gave us that gift tonight. Thank you. Anyone else have something a complexity they would want to share to give us a sense of some of what you're experiencing as you facilitate gatherings and meetings? Yeah, Machu, I see your hand up. Oh, you're right there.
Yeah, thank you. One thing I noticed is like sometimes the community groups I work in are beholden to like certain standards and requirements. They're very direct, hierarchical, efficient, and urgent. Whereas a lot of the community organizing is this collaborative, iterative, like collective process that doesn't always translate well into those spaces. And so finding a way to bridge the two is always an interesting challenge that I observe
Absolutely.
every week, every month.
Yeah. Yep. That's you know, because then there's assumptions and stories we tell about the other style often, right? Like that slow process versus where they may not be right or wrong, just in different contexts, they might be more effective. But again, can totally hear where that's going to lead to maybe metaphorical and literal headbutting around some things.
Yeah, and sometimes those differences get tense, and there can be an element of othering that happens. So,
Yeah,
yeah, great topic.
absolutely. Very, very yep, human response when we hit difference and then we feel the tension around that, right? So again, we can learn how to not go there, but when we notice it happening, we can remind ourselves like, yep, that's what people at our not when we're not at our best, it's easy to do that. Anyone else want to share? And again, feel free to use the chat. What are the complexities that you're experiencing or noticing? Well, what I suspect is that some of these will come out as we continue to talk about them. So I'm going to keep us moving. I want to share a bit about, again, we've already talked about some of the hopes for this particular workshop, but when I think about the purpose, really want to demystify some effective communication or facilitation techniques. And I want to say this from the top. I suspect because of the work you all do and the amount of spaces you're in where you're leading and you're navigating these complexities, I don't know that you're going to walk away from this thinking like, wow, that was amazing, rocket science. I've never thought of this concept before. In fact, that wasn't necessarily my hope. My hope is to give us a space where we can slow down and get out of maybe the task orientedness of the things we have to do every single day and really step back a little bit and you know, even as the name of this workshop series implies, get back to basics. Think about what are those core skills around connecting and leading conversations that we already know, but in high stress moments, it might be more difficult to access. And out of that, to practice some practical tools, and then to think about where you might be able to immediately apply those, so that you feel a bit more confidence and hope as you guide those conversations. Again, my sense is that humans disagree about quite a bit, but at the end of the day, we depend on one another for survival, for connection, and I think we're in a moment, and I don't think this is necessarily brand new, but where it maybe because of the level of polarization that is on display, I'm always hesitant to say that it's more polarizing than before. I think we're just it's out in the opener. It feels like it's a topic of conversation, and maybe with the amount of information we have access to, we're aware of it in new ways. But there's this way that we can feel like, well, I can only collaborate or move something forward if we have, you know, if we all agree on something very clearly, and it starts to limit who we can collaborate with. And then what I've already heard from Katie and Machu, at least in the spheres you're talking about, is, well, it's not an option to just limit down who I'm working with. Like, I have to navigate these complexities in order to get anything done. So I think this is a pretty essential skill building for us to do and to keep refining as facilitators. I want to notice that in the chat, Rosalie has added, I've not had a lot of experience facilitating meetings, but I have done some. I work with people living in assisted living facilities and memory care. I find challenges with dominant personalities, and in some diversity, equity, inclusion, justice work I do, just navigating challenges around how to keep conversations safe, but not bland, skirting challenging issues or nuances. Thanks for bringing that forward, Rosalie. That's such a great point around about not skirting around challenging issues or not trying to kind of tamp down or avoid the differences or the tension points, but to actually say, how can we build skills to lean into those, trusting that when we work through issues like that, if we can really dig down to what's at the core, we actually have an opportunity to build more trust and partnership. I was thinking the other day about the people I've had the most conflict with in my life also happen to be some of the people I'm closest to, because we worked through some pretty intense things. Now that takes a choice, right? And in not every setting we're going to be able to do that. But sometimes I think we think of conflict or tension as the thing that breaks trust or breaks relationship. But I wonder if even in our personal lives or in our other workspaces, you can think of examples of people that you're like, actually, I trust that person more because we kind of got into it around this topic and really got to a place of understanding, or could hear each other, or could move past the assumptions that we were making about one another's perspective or how someone was expressing something. So again, that doesn't always happen, but there's the potential for that to happen. So I want to pause again and just ask, you can share in the chat or come off mute. When you think about tools that would increase your confidence to navigate potentially divisive topics, what tools do you feel like you're in need of? Or maybe another question, another way to frame this would be, are there specific questions you find yourself returning to as you navigate these conversations?
I think what would increase my confidence is, when things get really tense, that moment when someone says something that the other person disagrees with, and they're both vocal about it, and there's a tension in the air, a way to kind of deflate that tension, to direct the group to a different frame of thinking.
Yeah. That's great, Alex. Thanks for that. We will also have time for Q&A at the end, but I wanted to ask this question now, partially because it might help guide how we move through the material. So if you have a thought about this, either a tool that would increase your confidence or a recurring question, please add it to the chat or come off mute.
I don't know how to frame this, but like, I've sometimes got into trouble when I thought that I could have a safe conversation with someone one-on-one, and it turned into a complete, just like a really surprising turn. And I wish that I had realized that I needed to have that conversation not one-on-one, and like, but not bring in someone that's gonna amp it up and they feel attacked.
Okay.
So like trying to figure out what's the right way to approach it, but also with whom, to like have an ally or a neutral party who can help me navigate it. Not, I guess, yeah, a neutral party, not an ally, because I don't want them to feel like ganged up on, but
Yeah.
one who can help me see the other person's perspective and guide me, kind of mediate between us, I guess. Sometimes it's hard to figure out, like, if I can't figure out how to talk to this person, then is there someone who is neutral that would be willing to be a mediator? Because it feels like there's always this binary of me versus them or something, and or us versus them. So trying to figure out who's neutral.
Totally. Well, and it sounds like, correct me if I didn't, I'm not understanding you, but that your sense going into some of these conversations is like, oh, it'll be safer because it is one-on-one. I'm not bringing this up in a group. I'm not adding another person to the mix that might communicate like, hey, this is a big deal. And instead, what you found was like, oh, actually, it was the opposite. Somehow it undermined safety, or it was more intense, and you really needed some kind of use the word a mediator in the mix. Thanks for that.
That kind of builds off something I experienced recently. Someone said to me, is this a safe space? And so like a whole list of like rules and agreements kind of went flowing through my head, like how can I support you in going forward in this conversation? So that might be a tool we all could use. It's like,
Yeah.
if someone says this is a safe space, how should you engage? And maybe should you not if you're not willing to or ready to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I might even add, I don't know if this is a tool, but maybe a distinction between, or what is the distinction between a space that is psychologically safe, right, and physically safe, but might still carry some emotional discomfort because we all have different levels of, we just have different tolerance for tension in a conversation, right? And so how do we're navigating all of those things um, in one conversation, right? And so how do we, there might be different skills in each of those buckets. And so how do we put those things together when we're having a conversation? All right, well, that's really helpful, hearing a little bit of context about where we're coming from. So just briefly, goals, so you can know what we're going to cover tonight. So nothing is a surprise. We're going to start with what's happening for us as the facilitator, or even if you're not facilitating, let's say a group meeting. Katie, I'm thinking of the example you just gave about even a one-on-one conversation. If you are the one bringing something forward, I think that still can feel like there's a facilitation role in that, because you're thinking about, how do I say this? How do I approach this? We're going to start with what's happening for us internally when a conversation is complex, divisive, difficult, however we want to describe that, and how to ground ourselves. And I want to emphasize, I don't think it's like less important to start there than things that might feel more tactile or more like concrete skills, because the way we show up, we facilitate, we lead out of who we are. And so whatever's happening in us when we encounter those moments, and again, we have different tolerances for that, that's going to come across for the people we're interacting with. So I want us to start there, because I think that awareness is really critical for how we move a conversation forward, or decide what is the best next step, or where do we need to pause and really sit with something and explore further. So that's where we're going to begin tonight, a little bit of self-reflective work. Then we're going to move over to some active listening skills. And not just how do we actively listen in general, but how do we actively listen so that we can hear what's the issue underneath, or at the deepest level, the core of what someone is saying. So how do we hear the words, but also hear what might be the heart of the matter, or what's at stake for a person who's sharing a message with us? After that, I didn't put this on the list. We're going to take a 5-minute break. So that should hit right about the halfway mark of this evening's content. And then when we come back, I sort of smooshed these last two things together. We're going to talk about shared language for identifying core values. And then we're going to get to what are some facilitation practices to help us communicate with clarity. Because sometimes when things get tense in a group, if we're feeling dysregulated in that, or don't really know where we want to move forward yet, how do we give ourselves the best chance at communicating clearly? Because even if we're not sure where to go, or we're having to tell a group we don't know exactly what the next step is, which is totally fine, when we can communicate that clearly, or even articulate the questions that are present for us, it can help a group feel more secure, or feel like, okay, even if we don't know exactly where we're going, this person leading the conversation has a sense, they're still guiding, even if they're sitting with their own questions. So that's what we're going to cover tonight. So as I mentioned, we're going to get started with talking about a little bit of self-reflective work. A very wise person told me years ago, and I've just kind of sat with this idea, that the hardest person we will ever lead is actually ourselves. So think about, in your context, someone that you feel like is difficult to influence, or think about a meeting setting where you're like, "Ooh, this person and we really disagree," right? And our thinking might be, wow, that individual is very difficult for me to influence. But I want us to take a step back and say, actually, when it comes down to it, we might be a difficult person to influence on our own, because we can get hijacked in a moment when disagreement surfaces. And so before we start talking about skills for how to guide a group through a difficult point or a divisive topic, I want us to just look at, well, what is happening for us when we hit those moments? So again, I don't think this is new information for any of you as you are involved in lots of complex work, but when we hit stressful moments, our brains go into survival mode because our brains do not distinguish between physical, mental, emotional, psychological threats. Our brain still perceives that as our ancestors way back in the past would have seen it as if a lion is charging us, right? So our system gets flooded with stress hormones, particularly if we're someone for whom tension in a conversation really raises the stress level. So I want to acknowledge that that may not be everyone. Again, we have different communication styles and preferences. We have different tolerance for tension in a conversation. I once had a supervisor who had the highest level of tolerance for tension in a conversation, to the point that he had to appoint someone on the team who would just kind of give him the heads up and say, bum, we've reached that point in the group where we cannot, like, you can tolerate this, the rest of us are dying right now. Like, can we please have a pause and discuss what's going on? I thought that was great self-leadership on his part, right? Because he knew that he experienced those conversations differently than the rest of the group, and he did what he needed to do to help the group have a better experience. But it would be great to know for ourselves, well, what is my stress response? When something gets tense, when I feel stressed, what's my stress response? So most of us will have one of these four. We'll have a fight response where we're like, all right, come at me, right? Like, you're gonna make a point, well, I have a counterpoint ready. I am a fight person. What happens for me physically is I get very hot, right? Like, and I can feel myself, like, I feel like my face turns red, I start sweating, and my brain starts going a mile a minute with the ways I could respond, right? Or trying to think about the best way to craft a response. So that could be a way a fight response shows up. Others of us, and some of it might depend on context. You may be a fight person in one context, but in another context, you're like, oh no, I am a runaway person. I am a flight. I'm going to get as far away from this as possible. In a facilitation setting, a flight response could look like you just, like, you see the issue that's on the table or where the tension is, and you're just like, how do I bypass this? How do I change the subject? How do we go in a completely different direction to just run away from that conversation? You might have a freeze response where your brain goes blank. You look like a deer in the headlights and you're like, I do not know what to do next. And inside you're panicking, or maybe it's that, I don't know if you've ever heard had people use the metaphor of, like, ducks on the surface of a pond look very calm, like everything's okay, but underneath they're paddling frantically. So maybe you stay calm on the outside, but inside you're like, I just, like, everything's fluttering. I don't know what to do next. And then finally, you might have a fawn response. A fawn response is where your desire for safety manifests as wanting to placate someone who might be coming across to you as angry or aggressive. And so you might do something or say something to try to make yourself feel like you're more likable to that person, or to diffuse their the energy that they're putting out. So for those of you who have thought about this before, or if you haven't, think about a recent moment in a conversation, whether it's one-on-one or in a group setting, where you hit something tense, divisive, a place of disagreement. Think about what you felt in that moment, and then which of these do you most identify with? You can respond in the chat, or you can come off mute and share. Okay, so Rosalie says B and A, that fight and then that flight. Yeah, and again, that can be totally contextual. I definitely have settings where I'm like, I don't know this person well enough, I'm gonna run away. Or actually, I care enough about this issue, that's just fight every time. So it's really gonna depend on the situation. Katie says freeze, followed by fawn, and then flight, but secretly wanting to fight. Absolutely, you can experience all four at once or in quick succession. Betty says it depends on the situation. Yep, that can definitely be the case. So again, what we want to normalize is that if you have a stress response when something gets tense, take a breath, you are human. So this is a normal human reaction. And again, that it's our brain working overtime to try to keep ourselves safe. And so if in the moment we can notice what's happening for us and then try to remind ourselves whether or not we feel it in the moment, that we are safe, right? We aren't being chased by a lion. We are interacting with other human beings. But noticing it is the first step. Oh, someone's sharing. I prefer to keep my screen off, but if I want to speak, I will turn my screen on. Perfect. That's great, Rosalie. Thanks for letting me know that. That helps me know what to expect. So when we notice, if we're able to pause, and again, I would say whatever your stress response is or whatever combination, it for a lot of us, it happens so automatically. Like that feeling for me when I'm in fight mode and I'm like, ooh, I'm getting very hot. Ooh, the thoughts are racing about how I'm going to respond to this person. I'm not listening. I'm just like in fight mode. That happens so quickly. If I can notice that it's happening and notice it without judgment, right? Noticing without saying, ah, you did it again. What's wrong with you, right? Or, oh, I can't believe you froze, like you're supposed to be leading this. How do you freeze? Just notice, oh, this is what's happening for me. Remind ourselves that we are safe. Then it might give us a chance to choose how we want to proceed, right? Before we figure out what we're going to do in the conversation, how do we want to proceed with ourselves? So a few ideas of what we can do if we've given ourselves a chance to pause and notice our stress response that's happening. First of all, just breathing. I know that sounds very obvious, but slowing down our breathing, and you can even do that. If we hit a tense moment in this conversation, I could just breathe, right? Just slow down my own breathing, and you might not even know that I'm doing it. But just to give a chance for oxygen to not just like hit our lungs, but to actually get to our brain and start calming down our nervous system. The simple act of breathing can reconnect us with our bodies and help us come down from that moment of being flooded by those stress hormones. If internally you're able to notice and naming what you're afraid of or what the threat feels like, even if it's just quick, or you grab a pen and you write it down on something next to you, even when you're in the midst of a meeting, again, naming that can help take away some of the power of whatever you're feeling. You can also give yourself the gift of calling a short break for the group, right? And you can name like, wow, we've hit a tense moment, not out of a desire to avoid this, but because this is so important and I want us to be set up to have this conversation. I want to set us up for a positive experience in this conversation. I want to call, we're going to take a 5-minute break so that we can come back and work at getting to the heart of what's just happened, right? It's okay to pause and model for the group that a pause is okay, rather than plowing forward. If you as the facilitator feel like, I need a moment to catch myself before we can move forward, that's totally okay. Sometimes I wonder if we feel the pressure, and I know the pressure is real, of time and urgency, but sometimes we do ourselves and the groups we lead a disservice when we're like, well, just got to plow through and I feel terrible and everyone feels terrible and let's just get it done, right? I don't know who is served by that approach, even though I totally get it. And I can guarantee you, if I thought for 5 minutes, I could tell you experiences where I've done that. Another tool I use is to scan the group, even in a virtual setting. If people are on camera, you can tell a lot about what might be going on emotionally for people from body language, from facial expression, even from someone moving back or leaning back from the camera versus leaning forward. If you notice in a conversation, whoa, something just got said, and I watched people like physically remove themselves back rather than leaning into a conversation, or ooh, I know the way this person usually talks, and I just heard a tone shift. That might just help you note some of the emotional states that are present. And then you can share those with the group, as you don't have to share them as pronouncements or like, hey, Ted, I just saw you lean away. What did that mean? Right? You don't have to call anyone out, but you can just say, I'm noticing this and I wonder if it might mean X, Y, or Z, right? Just to let people know that you're tracking some of the emotional tenor. And then Another tool I use is in the moment, if you're able to take a few breaths, think about and connect with, again, internally, what are your values? What do you want to bring when you're at your best? What are you connected to, right? When you step into a conversation. So one of my core values is around, it's just around relationships and um, fostering healthy, emotionally healthy connections with other humans. So in a tense moment, if I'm able to connect with that value and say, okay, this is what is most important to me, no matter what else happens in this meeting, I want to walk away feeling like I led out of a place of connecting in an emotionally healthy way with other human beings. How is that going to shift maybe what I'm saying next, or how I'm viewing other people in the conversation? So that's plenty from me in terms of some ideas. I would love to hear from any of you. What else would you add to this list of things that we can use as facilitators to pause and ground ourselves when we are like, oh yeah, I'm stressed. I just froze, right? Or I'm fawning because I'm trying to get this person to back down a little bit emotionally, or however that presents for you. What else would you add that we could learn from your wisdom and what you do regularly?
Guess one thing I've noticed is when you feel that gut feeling, you notice that fight or flight response. Like to me, that's a great opportunity or it signals that there's a lot of potential in the moment, either
Hmm.
saying yourself or someone else.
Yeah.
So it's like a call to, if it's safe to proceed, it's a great opportunity in the moment.
Yeah. That's a great, and it's almost like a reframe. If any of us have the internal story of like conflict, bad conflict, breaking relationship, right? This is going to fall apart. To actually say, oh, actually, this is my clue that we might be getting to something really good if we can safely dig to what's underneath.
Kind of like on the other side of that, if I'm caught off guard and like I don't understand what is happening, where this is coming from, there's a lot for me to learn or to understand that I'm just not seeing in the moment.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great perspective. Thanks for sharing that, Machu. What else? What have you found helpful? What have you seen facilitators do that you've been like, ooh, that's good. I want to try to incorporate that. Or what are you experimenting with for yourself in these, since you've all named, or many of you have named, and I assume for the rest of you it's just true, you've shared about these complex conversations that you're navigating as part of your daily work.
I think one thing I've admired about especially other women leaders that are in very high pressure jobs that I kind of look up to is their ability to remain steady in themselves by recognizing other people around them. And so they're not demanding, they're not kind of being hard in that way, but they are being clear and also being really like empathetic for other people. So like really showing appreciation for other people. And that like recognition just like helps them couch when they do have, something that they're saying, I need this to be a certain way or something. And like we're trying to get to this goal that it can be received. It can be received better with that empathetic kind of sandwich around it.
Sure. Yeah, so thinking about how messages get delivered so that they have the best shot at being well received. That's a great example. We have time for one more person would like to share. All right, I'll keep us moving. I'll just say, and you all know this is facilitators, right? That moment of like, how much space to give to let somebody jump in, but also not too much space that everyone's like, oh no, we've paused too long. So that's an art as well, as you all know, not so much an exact science. So again, I trust that you all have wisdom around how to do this. And sometimes it's a matter of getting in touch with that or realizing that, oh, in the moment, again, when things are tense or that urgency or the stakes are really high in the moment, it can be hard to access what we know, right? You can be someone who like, oh yeah, I tell other people to breathe all the time. But then when I'm in a tense moment, like stop breathing, right? Like we know that that's important, but it's hard to do in the moment. So my hope is that these are more reminders that you can think about like, oh yeah, what do I want to have in my back pocket or my tool belt that when this happens, I'm going to try this and see where that gets me. Or, actually, I'm not someone who really calls a break when we're at a tense moment or where I'm not sure how to move forward. Maybe I'll give that a try to give myself a pause and trust that it could be helpful for others as well. And I see Rosalie put in the chat, reminding myself that no one is my enemy and the same for others. Yeah, that's so powerful, Rosalie, and kind of reminds me of what Machu said earlier about when things get tense, that it can be easy for people in a group to default to othering, and then those comments start coming out, right? And then you're like, oh wow, now we've got a lack of safety in this conversation on top of the tension that's there. So that reminder is so powerful and important because in the moment, if it feels like we've hit that deep disagreement, it can very much feel like this person is my enemy. Rather than saying like, actually, is there a way that we want to work towards a similar goal? We don't have similar ways of getting there yet, and that's what we're trying to figure out. And that's less of enemy talk and more potential collaborator. All right, we're gonna shift over. So I know this is sort of, when I thought about this we're kind of giving like a little taste of these different things, and then you can decide what feels most applicable for you and what you might want to take further. The second area we're gonna talk about before we take a quick break is the role that active listening plays in these conversations. Um, and again, this actually connects with the stress response we might be having because when I'm stressed, probably comes as no shock, I'm not a very good listener. When I am stressed, I am focused on whatever feeling I'm happening physically and otherwise, right? I already shared my default confession is that I've got a list of what I want to say back or how I'm going to best present my argument for the other side of what's being talked about. And so I want to share just 3 levels of listening to be aware of when we're facilitating conversation so that we can first identify for ourselves which level we're operating at, and then try to work at moving towards the more global listening listed at the bottom. So internal listening, that's the listening that I do when I'm stressed, and maybe you relate to that. It's when you're preoccupied with your own thoughts, formulating what's going to be said next. You're actually not listening externally. I don't even know that we're capable of doing that because our brains are focusing internally on what we're saying and feeling. So that's internal listening. That is none of these are right or wrong. They're just different. So on some level, it's helpful to know what you are thinking and feeling. There's a way to listen internally that's really helpful. In a conversation where you're trying to help a group move forward, if your default is to be stressed out and listening internally, that's going to make it really difficult for you to hear what other people are saying. The next layer of listening, or next kind of level of listening, is focused listening. It's when we're able to take ourselves out of internal listening to the point that we can focus on what the other person is saying. So we might not yet be able to get beyond the words that are being said, but we're working really hard to say, okay, can I track with what this person is saying? What are the words they're using? What is the message they're expressing to me? And then the third level is global listening. And this is when we're actually able to go beyond the words that someone is saying. And we're also noticing the nonverbal cues. So the tone, body language, pauses, places where someone pauses or hesitate might give us as much important information as words they're saying. So global listening is when we're really able to settle in to a way of listening I've also heard it described as generative listening, where we're really tuned in to what the other person is communicating beyond the words. It's the words and everything else that they might be communicating, non-verbally and otherwise. So here's what I would like us to do. So actually, let me go back. Rosalie, yes, I see your hand.
Hey, thanks. Sorry, what was the second? You called that global listening something else. What was the other term you
The
used?
other term I've heard used for it is generative listening.
Generative. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for pausing, asking a question. Oh, I meant to say this earlier. So we are going to do Q&A at the end, but if you have questions along the way, what Rosalie just modeled is perfect. Like, feel free to raise a hand or throw something in the chat. That's totally fine. So again, before we move to the skills practice, when we think about the type of active listening we want to be doing, we're wanting to be settled enough and grounded enough as a facilitator that we have the chance to hit that global listening level. Now, what I'll also say with that, and you might already be intuiting this or know this from experience, again, if we're feeling really stressed, we sense the tension in a room or in a group conversation, guess what gets more challenging to do? Global listening is going to be really challenging. So it will take practice. Again, it will take practice when the stakes are lower to just get a sense of like, wow, when I'm really listening at that level to another person, what does that feel like to me? What do I notice about myself? That's the kind of practice it will take. For tonight, we're going to do a bit of a little step in that practice, just to practice that active listening muscle. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put us in breakout rooms. I'm probably just going to put us in pairs, actually, now that I look at our group. And what we're going to do is practice paraphrasing. So I would describe paraphrasing as a skill that fits in that second level of listening. Let me go back for a minute. The focused listening. Whoops, I went back too far. I would put paraphrasing in focused listening, because paraphrasing is when we are able to slow down a conversation enough. So we're just repeating back what we've heard another person say to make sure that we've heard their meaning. A distinction I like to make is that when we paraphrase, we're not adding our interpretation. It really is a simple message check of the words someone said. I used to think this was sort of basic, for lack of a better term. Like paraphrasing, yeah, we all know how to do that, right? You're just trying to repeat back what someone says. Until I did it in couples therapy and realized, oh, paraphrasing's harder than I thought. Not adding an interpretive layer, that was tough for me. Actually, the slowing down of a conversation to really check, am I hearing what you're laying down, right, to the other person? And to give the other person a chance to say, yeah, you got that, or like, no, you changed a word and that's not the word I meant. I meant this word, right? So I ate my humble pie and realized, you know what? It might be a basic listening skill, but I don't practice it enough. And I wonder what would happen in conversations if I actually practiced and slowed myself down enough to do that. So here is the, what we're gonna, oops, wrong, I did the wrong thing. So here's what I want you to do. I'll put this in the chat too. In your breakout room, once I turn us loose, I want you to just each take turns answering the question, what is something you experienced today? So talk about maybe low stakes, maybe not, depending on the day you had. And what I want you to do is take turns. So one person start out by being the person who shares the response to that question. What's something you experienced today? And maybe keep your response to 3 to 4 sentences tops. Mostly because we want to be kind to the person listening to us who has to paraphrase back what they heard. So let's not overwhelm each other at this point in the day with whole paragraphs of things that we experience. So I'm putting this in the chat. What is something you experienced today? Keep your response to 3 to 4 sentences. And then when it's whoever is giving the answer to that question, the other person's job is just to practice paraphrasing back what they heard, right? And then you, as the person who shared, gets to either correct or adjust or say, oh, I feel like you heard me. And then I want you to swap roles So each person gets a chance to do that. And then we'll come back, debrief that briefly, and then take a break. Any questions about what we're about to do? Just very, very quick practice.
I guess one person says it, repeats back, the next person says something, repeat back.
Yes. Yep. And again, the question, you can change this question if you want. The question I'm suggesting in the chat is, what is something you experienced today? And then keep your response to 3 to 4 sentences max. All clear? All right, I'm going to create these groups. And I'll see you back here. I'll give us, I'm going to give us about, this is going to be quick. So I'm going to give us I'm going to give us 5 minutes to do this. So you got to jump in, somebody share, paraphrase back, switch roles, and then I'll give you Zoom will give you a 1-minute warning before the rooms close. So we'll be back here in about 6 minutes when all is said and done. Okay, I'm opening the rooms now. Oh, whoops, I have to. Oh no. Okay, now it works. Now the rooms are open. Sorry about that. Creating breakout rooms in Zoom can be challenging. All right. I never know how to put host and co-host in the breakout room, so we don't get a breakout room, Alex. We get to be in the regular room.
Saying that's all right, that's fine.
Yeah. And we can choose if you want to do the exercise, we can do it. If not, I would gladly take any feedback you have at this midpoint before we continue.
I think you're doing a great job being very engaging. Notice that your voice has like different octaves, and that's great to demonstrate. Yeah, we just have a small group and it's very intimate.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is kind of nice, because then I feel like, especially when we get to I might rethink the activity I was going to have us do in breakout rooms at the end, because it might just feel silly to do it in breakout rooms. And maybe we just workshop something live that they're encountering. Maybe we just do that as a whole group. If someone is like, hey, I've got this thing going on, let's talk about it. So we'll do the same exercise, but just not do it in small groups. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, one, I think that's a fine idea. It keeps it also, we can record it, and that's kind of nice.
Okay.
Two, it seems like we have a shy group. So I
Yeah.
wonder if they'll respond better to being in breakouts.
That's a good point.
But I don't know. You can ask the group, I guess.
Yeah, I could ask what they would prefer. And I'll set it up by saying this is the intention for this time.
Mhm.
You know, and maybe I would say if there's someone who's like, even if one person is like, yeah, I would love to have my scenario kind of workshopped by the group, because then it gives other people would get to choose how much they contribute or not contribute to that conversation.
Right.
But if if people are like, absolutely not, I don't want to do that, then I'm like, yeah, we'll put you in big breakout rooms and you can talk. Okay.
That sounds fine.
I'm going to make a note of that. So when I heard, I don't know if maybe Machi said this at the beginning, when you talked about it being a pilot program, as in you all wanted to experiment with what happens if we offer this series
The
to work
idea
with
was
and see like what's the impact, or what's sort of what's being piloted?
just the idea that we want to know what the community wants as far as like skills and things that we can offer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So we just threw a dart in a dark room and
Okay.
all right, we'll try these out. This seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
I suppose when we send out feedback forms, we'll get a sense of what people wanted and what they-
Totally. Yeah, I was just curious what the kind of context was of how it came to be. Okay, they have 30 seconds and then I'm going to close the rooms. Oh, I can see who's talking in each room. Okay. Welcome back, Betty. Everyone's getting zoomed back, whooshed back through time and space from the breakout rooms. Welcome back, everyone. As I mentioned before, let's do just a brief debrief before we go into a 5-minute break. What was that like? And specifically, I want to know, what did you notice for yourself when you were the paraphraser? You can come off mute or you can share via the chat if you'd like to share.
I'll just say that as a paraphraser, I found like I was super intent on listening to every word. And then as it went on, I was trying to just relax, just listen to what she's saying. But
Yeah.
initially I was like, I wanted to get every word.
Totally. And, you know, admittedly, I set that up, or I set you up to do that when I said, everyone's assigned to be a paraphraser, right? Like, you didn't show up tonight thinking that's what you're going to be practicing. So we all, you know, we likely go into like do it right mode or wanting to figure out, okay, this is the assignment. So that makes sense. I'm glad you hit a moment where you felt like you could relax and listen.
For me, I was really focused on like how, when the first time I was hearing it, how that made the person feel. And then I realized when I was saying it back that I didn't really remember all the details. And this is usually what happens to me in conversation, is I repeat it back to them and then I ask a question to clarify, like, so is this what happened? And then, but it didn't have a chance to really ask further questions, but it really made me want to ask more questions to clarify if I did understand all the details.
Totally. What I love about this in conversations, I love the way it slows us down, right? To really check our own listening. But I also love that as we're listening to things, it gives us so many opportunities for open-ended questions when we're listening at that level, like, oh, what would I ask next? Or what would I want to check on? Or so I think there's just lots of opportunity in that. So yes, I didn't give you enough time to do that further question asking, but I like that you noticed you had more questions to ask at that point. Katie, can I ask you a follow-up question about what you shared? So what you first said was, I was kind of noticing how what the other person was feeling. Can you say more about that? Like, what were you noticing? Not necessarily the feelings, but just what were you picking up on or trying to pay attention to?
I was trying to understand how that experience that they had today made them feel in the moment, and as they were reflecting on it, like, what was the challenge that they had emotionally in that situation, and really nail that down, which sometimes comes from the subtext and, like you said, the global listening.
Yeah.
From the details, because those details can inform, you know, how we feel about how something went. Like, did it go the way we wanted it to, or was it something that went another way and we wish it had gone another way?
Yeah. That's great. Great thing to be aware of. And I love that you were practicing at trying to add in that global piece. Machu or Betty, any reflections on what that was like for you? No pressure, just want to invite if you'd like to share.
Sure, it was a great challenge. Just to kind of, did I hear everything? Am I understanding what your experience was? But then by the time I got to the end, I wanted to know more. Like, were you feeling this because? And I'm like, well, I've paraphrased back, but it kind of invite or the follow-up question, further inquiry. So
Yeah.
starting to paraphrase led to better conversation. Or just it's a good technique in facilitation.
Yeah, that's so interesting because both now you and Katie have what it makes me think of and what you both talked about is the role that curiosity can play in these kind of conversations, right? Especially these, like, we're hitting a divisive moment, stakes feel high, there's tension. Curiosity can go out the window too. And so both of you identified, like, well, I paraphrased back, but then I had more questions. Like then I had used the word inquiry, Machu. So isn't that interesting that what we need in these conversations where things feel tough to navigate with a group, we actually need more curiosity. And so even this tiny skill, or what feels like a tiny skill, can help us access that, perhaps in an unexpected way. So again, just something to think about how this could be incorporated, or if you're in a tense moment, you really need to slow something down. You don't have to announce to the group, I am now going to paraphrase, right? But you can just know, all right, I'm going to give this a try and see if that gets us anywhere. See if that can even access your own curiosity if you feel a little stuck. And tense about what you're hearing from another person. Third facilitation skill, when we're trying to build community, move a group toward collaborating together, moving forward on something, and we've hit a divisive topic or what feels like two 180-degree opposite approaches to how to move forward, or just disagreement or tension around something that feels hot button or live with the group. The third skill for facilitators is working on being able to identify values. And there's a couple of angles to this. And I think even if I were to be more specific about how the skill plays out, it is what I said at the top when we were going through the goals of the time. It's the ability to quickly get at what is at the heart of this issue, or these are the words being said back and forth. What's underneath this? And when we're able to do that, we have a shot at being able to identify, even if we're coming at this in very different ways, or our perspectives seem completely opposite, we have a shot at being able to identify, is there a shared value underneath this disagreement or this tension that can at least be named? And then we can talk about the options for how to move forward. So when we're talking about values, definition on the screen that I'm using for tonight, values are individual beliefs that motivate people to act in one way or another, and they serve as a guide for human behavior. However, they can also be held communally. So when we think about when we encounter cross-cultural differences across many different communities, there are collective values that might be held in a specific way, generally by community. It doesn't mean that every single person in that community will identify that as a core value in the same way, but there might be some commonalities around that. So little example I would give, many years ago, I was part of a cultural exchange program that took students from a US university and paired us with students from a university in Xi'an, China, which is the ancient capital of China, like kind of right in the middle of the country. And we watched this video our first day in class together, and it was an artist who had been born in China but raised in Germany starting in her teenage years, and she had these pictographs about how Western culture thinks about this topic versus Eastern culture. And it was really fascinating seeing it depicted in pictures. So one of these pictures was the view of the boss in a work setting or in an organization. And in Eastern culture, generally, the picture of the boss was really, really big picture, and then the rest of the people were really little. And in Western culture, her sense was that, well, the boss is sort of just one of the group. Now that may not always play out, but that was her sense of this is a difference between how these two cultures view this one topic. And how I would articulate that as values is there's a value underneath each of those views for how we think about authority, what role authority might play, what role hierarchy might play. Those are those individual or cultural beliefs that are guiding then how we might relate to someone in a position of supervising us, depending on what culture we come from. If we have a view that the boss is much more important than us, or has is to be deferred to, we might not ask questions of them, right? We might not ever raise a counter opinion, versus if we're in a culture that values speaking up or all the views being put on the table, we might be quicker to speak up. So that's just a small example of how that can play out. When it comes to the groups we're leading, most of us adopt the values that we're raised with. And then it's pretty normal to view those values and the things that guide, the things we care about that guide our behavior as, well, these are the right values because it's how I navigate the world. And even though those values might be rooted in a particular culture or experience, I assume they are the right ones. And then what happens when we have people encountering differences, right, in our conversations, we're all coming to the table believing are the values we try to act out of are the right ones, which by default means when we hear someone who might be operating, or we might assume is operating from a different set of values, it might be easy to assume, well, those are the wrong values. So the skill I'm asking us to think about is when I hear something said in a group setting, I see the tension level get raised. Am I able to slow down enough to think about the words someone is saying, to ask questions in a way that might get at what's the value underneath that, so that I'm able to identify for the group any opportunity for shared values that could be named and move forward out of. So first step to this, before you do it for a group, is probably to understand what your own core values are. So I'm going to give you a quick exercise, not to do now, but something you can do if this is not something you've thought about. A lot of us have a general sense of what our values are, but it can be really helpful to articulate them. So I'll put this in a chat as well. You can find, if you just type in values list in whatever your search engine of choice, you can find a list of values. And then I would say, print it out and circle your top 20. I'm typing this as I speak, so if this sounds weird, and turns out I'm not that great at talking while I type, I want you to narrow down to your top 20 first, then narrow down to 10, and then finally narrow down to 5. And I'm saying 5 because maybe that's like 5 or 6. Maybe those are the things that play out, or that are the things you really want to make sure you're operating out of on a daily basis. These values could shift over time. In some ways, in certain contexts, you might value one thing over another. At a certain stage of your life, you might value one thing over another. But it's really helpful to know, you as someone guiding a conversation, what are your core values? It can also be, this is a freebie, but a great exercise to do with a group to try to identify what are shared values among the group. Like, are there some shared values? Or to ask a group, what do you think are our values as a group? That can also open up conversations that could be really interesting. But do this first for yourself. And that's so that, again, in those stressful moments, what you're rooting in, what you want to stay connected to as you move forward. But it's also because it just gets you in touch with the idea that these values are operating for all of us all the time, whether we're conscious of them or not. And so I think it puts us in a frame of mind where we're able to consider that, if I assume that the other person I'm talking to, or the person speaking up in this meeting, is a reasonable human being, what might a reasonable human being be driven by in this moment? It can help us take us out of, I think, Rosalie, you said earlier, kind of that temptation to view other people as the enemy in a process. And it's like, no, I can assume this is another reasonable human being. What are they driven by? What might be a value that they're holding that feels like it's being threatened in this conversation? Maybe it's safety. Maybe it's something about who they are. They feel like they're not being seen fully, right? That's what's being threatened. Maybe they have a deep value for, I'll pick up on something Machu said earlier about like the type of process we have. We want to have something slower and more iterative, right? That's a value that's held because it's collaborative. And it feels like, however, the way a process is moving forward is violating that value. So learning to use the language of values can help us identify for ourselves what's at stake for us in any given conversation. And it helps us begin to think about what's underneath statements that people are making. And then as we get more comfortable with it, it can help us craft questions to ask people in a group to help them connect with what they're saying and what's the value underneath, right? Even just ask someone, hey, I hear you saying this. What's at stake for you, right? Or what's the thing you value that's behind what you're asking for or what you're expressing in this moment? Oops, I don't want to move forward yet. Questions or comments about this value piece or how it plays into facilitating when tension is present in a conversation.
Would an example of a conflict or tension be saying what you're observing as a value being practiced or held and asking if that's correct?
Yeah, it could be. Let me see if I'm understanding. Like, you as the facilitator offering, like, I feel like I'm hearing this value, or asking if that's checking in to see if your sense of the value that might be present is actually what the other person experiences.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, you could totally do that. Because I also think, and some of what I've experienced is that it can help another person diffuse some of their own stress response that they might be having to tension in a conversation. I think it also models curiosity, and that you're not pronouncing, well, clearly this value is at stake for you, Lisa, like let's talk about that. But you're actually offering something and checking in, and it's giving them a chance in the moment to reflect and say, is that true for me? And I think for some people, even if you don't get the value correct, what they might say is like, oh, it's not that, it's actually this, right? It actually helps them connect with what might be happening underneath their words or underneath the emotion that they're expressing. So that's a great example and technique. Anyone else have a thought about this or a way you've seen it used?
I haven't necessarily seen this used, but I am reflecting on a number of situations where things have gone off the rails in DEI-J committees, where this would have been really key to identifying obvious issues in a way that was not othering to people.
Yeah, that's a great example. Because again, I think it's, again, as we normalize, like, people are different, we're going to disagree, right? Like, sometimes when we come to a group gathering, you just named, Rosalie, like a DEIJ committee, right? So I think sometimes there could be an assumed like, hey, we're doing this committee, we all have the same values, right? It's this assumption about what's at stake for everyone. And then when we hit those moments, it feels like, wait a minute, I thought we had the same values, right? Like, and so then tension. So anytime we're gathering a group, we really have an opportunity to create shared norms and not take anything for granted about what might be shared values or not shared values, right? But at the very least, I don't think it's a problem we hit those moments where we realize our assumption was off, because again, one perspective we can have is it gives us an opportunity to dig a little deeper. And it actually is a moment of like, oh, we made an assumption here. Let's back up let's pause, let's explore a little more, and then see if we can identify with clarity, oh, what are our shared values and how could we move forward out of those. So that's a great example, Rosalie, and very relatable. I'm sure everyone on this call can think of moments where like, oh yeah, that happened and we had no sense of or we didn't in the moment identify what the values were underneath. And again, we are all operating out of a sense of value, whether we articulate it or not, whether we're conscious of it or not. So I think we actually do groups a great service when we're able to start using the language of values and help model where we're able to be in touch with those things and articulate them for ourselves, and where we can do that for a group as well. And again, the goal is not just values for the sake of values, like, yay, values. It really is, we want to be able to identify a place of shared values underneath the tension, because that gives us even just a kernel of something we can build. But if we don't have a place of what we're sharing, it's easy to default to like, well, let's just squish down the differences or try to bypass the tension in order to move forward. And my suspicion is that that's a little flimsier of a foundation to build on compared to if we can identify shared values. It can be a little more of a structure that we return to when things get tense. Ooh, let's take a moment and remember, we all care about people experiencing bodily safety in our community, all people experiencing that, right? If that's the shared value, we can come back to that over and over again when we hit tense points. I'm going to keep us moving forward so that we have time for Q&A at the end. Last things I want to think about is that and this is where I said I kind of squish these together, when it comes to very practical facilitation skills, in thinking about, okay, how do the tension has erupted, or emerged, bubbled to the surface, whatever we want to say about it. I've done the work as the facilitator of identifying my own stress response, and I've got that. I'm managing myself well with that. Okay, step one. Two, I have on my best, I'm giving my best attempts at active listening as we continue this conversation. I'm reflecting back, I'm paraphrasing, I'm asking follow-up questions that model curiosity. I've asked enough of those questions that we've actually been able to get to a sense of articulating a shared value. All of those things have happened. Now, what do I do as the facilitator? So some skills, again, just 3 other things that I imagine you already have in your tool belt, but to sort of draw them to your attention. Or if you don't think about these things regularly, where could you incorporate these? 3 things I use most frequently when I facilitate are to synthesize. And when I'm synthesizing, I'm summarizing what's been said, or I'm trying to give my 1 to 2 sentence, this is what's happening in the group right now. Or if I were coming out of a conversation about values, here's the value I'm hearing that we all agree on, and then I'm positing it back to the group. What do you think about that? What are you hearing? Right? But synthesizing is such a powerful skill, especially if a conversation feels like it's all over the place. Sometimes think about a conversation that you've been in like that. We just crave someone to say, can we just say what's happening right now? Or can we just can someone give the brief, where are we at in this process? So synthesizing helps you identify for the whole group, where are we at in the process? What are the tensions that have come up? What are the shared values that we've identified? The other skill is to name when something has happened. This is not, and I would say this is not necessarily a linear skill, like, hey, we go through self-management of our own stress response, then we move to active listening, then we go to values. It's not linear. So naming can happen at any point. When you notice the body shift or the tone shift or something gets said that has, there's a strong emotion behind it, we can just name that something has happened. And the way I've been experimenting doing this is to try to name what's happened without adding an interpretation or even a judgment to it. I do it by simply saying something happened. And then I give the group a chance to articulate what just happened. Or the person, like let's say Katie and I are in a conversation Katie, I'm just going to put you on the spot. I'm going to name things that may not be true about you, right? Katie and I are in a conversation. I'm facilitating a group with Katie. I look over at Katie, and Katie has what I would describe, I'm interpreting as an angry face, right? And she's gone from a neutral face to a face that feels tense and angry, right? I'm not even going to name necessarily, Katie, I notice you have an angry face. Would you like to tell us what's going on now? I'm just going to pause and say, oh, I wonder if something just happened, or I sense that something just happened, right? And give the group a chance to interact with that. Some people may say, like, yeah, something did happen and I don't feel prepared to share yet, or I'm not ready to talk about it. Great. I will also say naming more specifically than just saying, hey, something happened, let's talk about it, right? When something is said or done in a group that can be harmful to someone, it's also important to name that, right? Like, ooh, I just heard language used that sound really dehumanizing. I'm going to pause us right there, because here's what happens when that kind of language is used. Or, hey, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I'm actually going to cut you off because what I just heard, here's the impact that has on other folks in our group who experience the world this way, right? You're doing the work of naming. And that includes naming harm if you need to name harm and interrupting that. So that's the second skill. We're synthesizing, figuring out where we can synthesize for the group to help us all have the same awareness of what's happened or what's going on or where we're at in the process. We're naming, which involves both noticing when there's been a shift or there's emotionally something's going on in the group. We're also naming when we need to interrupt, pause, reduce harm in a conversation or stop harm from happening. And then the last skill that we use is to offer options forward. Sometimes as the facilitator, this may need to come after a pause, right? Or you may need to say, hey, we're out of time for today. I'm gonna come back next week with options for moving forward based on our conversation today. I'd invite all of you to be thinking of the options you see as well. Please shoot me an email, right? Or send me your input on that. Some of us are really skilled at thinking quickly in the moment, and we can see options, we can hear options, and we can name those for the groups in a process. So there's not a right way to do that, but it's a way of letting the group know that you see a way forward, even if it doesn't feel like there's a way forward yet. And an option can be as simple as saying, you know, I sense we need some more time to explore this, or we need to like actually get clear on where we have a shared value. I'm going to suggest we do that work offline and come back together next week, right? Or our next meeting is scheduled for this date. Could we do that then? And ask the group. It's also really powerful to let the group share what options they see, so that it's not just on you as the facilitator, but that you're actually inviting collaboration on like, hey, you've heard the same things I've heard. What's your interpretation of this? Where do you see a path forward? It's a great practice to trust the group's ability to hear, to see, to pick up on things that you may not have picked up on, even when you're trying really hard to do that. I think that models something really great as a facilitator in trying to create a collaborative space. So I want to pause again before we do our last activity to ask anything else you would add in terms of practical skills that you use when you're leading a conversation that you've seen be really effective in moving forward as you're navigating complex issues.
I like one thing you did say that resonated with me, because I think it's one of my habits that I think I gotta keep doing, is after adding some input about like my take, I guess, is saying like, hey, that's just my take, and I would really like to make space for other people to add their input and feedback.
Mm.
I'm really curious what other people think as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great practice. And part of that reminds me, Katie, part of what I'm hoping happens as we're going through this content is my hope is that you're walking away not just with like, oh, this is something I want to try, but you actually feel affirmed in something you already do naturally or pretty well. So you can think about, how do I lean into that more? Or how do I utilize that more in those moments where it feels like the tension could break trust, how do I model a way forward by inviting group input that actually might build more trust or help people see that I see them as capable and having insight. So that's a great, I'm so glad that you identified that for yourself.
Sometimes I feel like when there's a sense to have a solution to a situation, just asking people like, what might a solution look like? And if that's not we can't imagine that because we're here in this issue, what might it feel like? Like what feel good if we were to get there?
Yeah. That's great because what I love about it's so effective because that feeling experience, even if we can't paint the picture yet or imagine it or see it, that feeling is what helps drive the motivation to get to whatever that thing is. And so that's just such a powerful way to help a group move through whatever the emotions they're experiencing when there might be a tense moment. Because we all know what it feels like to get to a solution, right? Or to get to the other side. So that's a great tool. Thank you for sharing that. All right, well, there's more we could talk about, but I think my sense is anytime we're trying to focus on, skill building or figuring out what are tools to use, none of us can try to practice 5 new tools at once. So my encouragement would be, of all the things, and I actually want to pause right now and give us a chance to do this, of all the things we've talked about, and actually I'm going to go back to that goal thing before we do this last activity. Of all the areas we've talked about, the kind of knowing yourself, your own stress responses, active listening skills, the value piece, identifying values, and then these kind of practical, what do you say as a facilitator in the moment in these conversations? I want you to identify for yourself, you don't have to share this with me or anyone, I'm just kind of giving us a little reflective moment. Which of these areas do you want to give more attention to? And is there one of these areas or something we've talked about that you feel like, I think I'm doing this well. And what this did was it reminded me that this is a powerful thing to do and I want to keep doing this. So just on your own, and I'll put this in the chat. I would maybe describe this one area of strength in your facilitation practices that's coming up for you tonight. So identify that for yourself, maybe write it down somewhere, or type it on a note where you're going to see it. I'm one of those people that puts sticky notes with important things that I want to remember all over my computer screen. So if you're one of those people, do that. And maybe one area you want to explore more as a growth edge. So give yourself a moment to identify, of these areas we talked about, what's a strength in your facilitation and what's an area you might want to grow in. And while you jot that down or think about that, for those of us who are more internal processors, that probably it's not going to be enough time. So maybe those are just identifying those as something you sit with and you kind of just notice over the next few days, like, I'm still thinking about this piece, or wow, I really want to do that values exercise for myself to get a sense of what are the core values I'm operating out of right now. Think about how you might want to practically apply that. So here's the last thing we're going to do, and I want to ask what the group would like to do. So initially, the thought was to do this in breakout rooms. and let people come up, kind of workshop their own example of something divisive they might be currently facing in a conversation or a recent experience, and go through these 4 areas that we talked about and identify, all right, what was going on for me, or I anticipate this conversation, kind of in some ways giving yourself a bit of a plan for how you might address this going forward. Since we are such a small group, an option would be if someone has an example that they're like, oof, this is live for me. Like, I have a conversation next week where I'm anticipating this could happen, or like, oh, my last conversation on this went sideways. If there's something that we could workshop briefly together, we could do it all together instead of trying to do this in breakout groups. So I want to poll the group and ask, what's your preference? Do you want to stick all together and try to workshop something, or do you want to break up into pairs and talk about something you're facing and how this might apply?
I'm totally comfortable with either option, but I agree that the group is small. We
Yeah.
could probably just work together.
Yep. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that, Rosalie. Katie, how do you feel about that? Would you want to is sticking in the group and talking about something okay?
Yeah, we can totally stay here in this big group,
Okay,
bigger.
great. Let's do that, 'cause we're gonna do this. We're gonna do this pretty quickly. So, and what this will maybe require is, does someone have either an upcoming conversation or something that recent? So we can either do this as kind of like a forward thinking, prepping you for a future conversation, or debriefing a recent conversation to say like, okay, like let's talk about what was going on. And if it's something live for you, I would just say maybe a good practice would just be to mask any identifying details about other folks involved, and just to make it as like vague of a situation as possible. But is there someone who wants to have either an upcoming conversation worked on or debrief a recent conversation? And I'll also say, if we don't have any takers from this, we'll do a different bit of a discussion. So let me pause on that and just say, well, to what I said earlier, is there anyone who wants to use this time to workshop or debrief something?
I could offer up a conversation that was very difficult not too long ago.
Okay, great. Thanks, Machu. And just to set the stage or expectations, as we move through this, like some of the questions Machu will be answering as the person who is involved in it, but fair game for anyone else on the call to like add any comments, right? Or insights that you're having as we talk through this.
So in a group setting, a person came to the group expressing their frustration over people without housing security, and had an idea to protest their presence in a space. And all I could hear, I'm not sure I heard him, like what his values being expressed were.
Okay.
But I felt the feeling of like, you are asking us to not recognize this person's human rights, their right to exist, and find a working solution somewhere in the middle. I felt like it was being asked to go to an extreme. And so their ask was like to us, like, please take a stance on this, support me in this campaign, but I want you all to do the work. I want you all to do this. So I feel like in that moment, I may not have been hearing what values he was operating from. So I maybe had a difficult time understanding where he was coming from. Just because what I was hearing was wrong to my ears.
Yeah, totally. How were you? Can we back up just a little? I just want to say, great example, right? I am having I'm having a feeling response myself, right? As you described, the situation. So when you think back on that conversation, to the best of your recollection, as this person is sharing this desire and the ask that they're making, what were you what were you feeling? Like, and even in terms of like stress response or tension level, what would you identify for yourself?
Yeah, sure. There definitely was stress. You feel
Mm,
like someone's coming to you asking you to do something and, wanting to help out community conversation. You feel compelled to come with an answer. But I think I was feeling just a bit outraged,
hmm,
just
hmm.
being asked to the point of where I didn't want to honestly entertain the conversation in the moment.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense and feels like a relatable response. So as you think about that, um, what in like if that let's say you show up tomorrow, same person shows up again, same request, almost identical, right? In that conversation, what is something you noting your own outrage, right? Because that's a valid feeling that you're experiencing. What how would you want to practice active listening as you're engaging with that person?
At the very least, name my own feelings and
Hmm. Hmm.
understand like why those feelings are emerging. What values do I feel are not being honored?
Yeah.
And then checking with them to see, if I've shared my piece, ask them, you've come to me though, or us as a group, because some value of yours is not being held. What is that value? Can you name
Mm.
them? That might help me understand where you are coming from. Maybe we
Yeah.
could find a shared value somewhere in the middle of all this.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I love, and you named this earlier, right? You used this as the example when you said, like, oh, when we're talking about values, is part of checking values, like asking the other person, what are your values, right? Or I hear this value. Is that accurate? So I think what's great about that is it doesn't have to be all on you on the facilitator to identify the value. You can just ask the person, what is the value underneath this, right? They may not have an answer yet. No one may have asked them that question. They might get more upset because they feel like the value is so obvious and they don't understand why you don't share it, right? But at the very least, um, questions model something really helpful no matter how the other person responds. And so hopefully that might get you to some area or at least an understanding of what value they were carrying, right? Now, the tricky thing is it's possible that that person tells you their value and you're like, well, here's the thing, that value is not actually held, right, by our organization, or that is like, I don't know a way to bridge that. So you might even have to break it down further to actually identify, is there a way that we could move forward. I'm curious for you, um as you talked about this, I'm imagining this is tricky. Even if you're not aware of what values he was operating from, is there any area of common ground that you could identify with this other person, even if it's like teeny?
Sure. I mean, we're all people on this planet together. We
Mm,
all, live in a community. And so like I think him and I alike both want like the right to rest and, privacy. And I think
mm,
that would be an area of like probably shared value that maybe he felt wasn't being held up for reasons real or imagined.
yeah, that's great. Um, it's okay if sometimes the common denominator is we're both human, right? And if that's the starting point that we as the facilitator have to remind ourselves of in a tense situation, like, okay, I don't know yet how to get to moving forward. I don't know yet if it's possible that we're going to have a place of shared values, but at the very least, we are humans who are share. I heard you say sharing space, right? And I also heard you say, oh, he wants privacy. He probably wants this, right? Already there's even if you disagree with how he's asking for that or the way he's going about that, you're identifying like, okay, I understand what it's like to want privacy. Like, I think we share that, right? Like, sometimes there's power in being able to name that for another person, that you see and you hear that, even if you're not able to respond to the request the way that they want you to respond. It doesn't always diffuse the tension, but sometimes the simple act of somebody feeling heard can go a long way. So I realize I didn't, again, we're not getting to solutions, but thank you, Machu, for being willing to debrief a conversation and something that was real and that you experienced that sounds like it was a little rattling.
Yeah, absolutely. Tough conversation. And so, you know, these shared values are just a really helpful way of getting at the heart of the matter.
Yeah, for sure. So I hope what that does is jog all of our thinking about, either past conversations or things coming up. And my encouragement would be just play with one or two of these things. Again, one area that you might want to grow in, and then one area that you feel like, oh, that's already a strength. How do I lean into that as you think about upcoming conversations? That we don't have to fear the disagreement or the divisiveness. I think our world needs more places where people can have those kinds of conversations. And I would propose that actually the lack of spaces that can handle and hold the complexities of those things, it's not actually getting us to a better place, right? And so I realize it doesn't make it easy. It's not simple. It doesn't mean things get tied up nicely at the end of every meeting, but it is good work that you're involved in to keep struggling forward and with the dogged belief that out of that shared humanity, we actually can find ways to collaborate, even if on the surface it's like, I don't know how that's possible. So I want to pause us here and just open it up for any Q&A. And again, I consider this is a group discussion. So if you have insights about a question, I often turn questions back on groups because I am a fellow learner and practitioner with you all, not, oh, I have this all figured out. And so conversations never go sideways under my facilitation. False.
I just wanted to say thank you to Machu as well for sharing that example, because I felt it was similar to a couple of situations that I have been in that just have felt so raw and tense, and just have not been identified as, wow, this is where we are and this is hard and maybe we need to take a pause or whatever it is. So I really appreciated that, because it really reminded me of it helped me reflect on some situations that I feel like now I could think about those were they to happen again in the future. So thanks. And you as well, Andrea. I appreciate that. I hope I pronounced your name right. Is it
Yeah.
Andrea? Andrea.
Go ahead, Andrew. But I also know it's one of those names, right, that has multiple pronunciations. And so it's we default to whoever we know, right, who was an Andrea or an Andrea.
Oh, Andrea.
Yeah.
Are you
So,
Andrea?
no, I'm an Andrea.
Oh, I got it right.
Yeah, you
Okay.
did. You did.
Thanks.
I will say, like, one of the things you shared tonight, talking about maybe we don't have an answer, or maybe we can't continue this conversation, but let's take a break. I think that's just a really valuable thing to keep in mind, that you have in your back pocket. That we all have to have solutions, and that's part of the process.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I just think I think all the time about what we're modeling in our leadership when we're guiding conversations. And so what seems like such a simple act of being like, we're going to pause, right? Like we're going to come back together and give each other a breather. Like, that's what we want other people to do too when conversations get tense for them, right? Instead of reaction on top of reaction on top of reaction. So yeah, letting go of that pressure internal or external around getting to the end goal, right? Or getting to the solution can be helpful. And you know what? One thing you can do as a facilitator too, that I think about, because so much is about expectations that we set. If you know you're about to guide a group through a challenging process where you are already aware of some of the places where you might hit tension, you could name that on the top end. One of the things I will do as the facilitator is pause us when we get to these points. It's not because I want to avoid it. Again, I'm very clear and explicit about the why behind what I do, because sometimes when we don't give the why, it leaves it open to interpretation, right? And someone who really wants to get into the conflict might be like, Andrew's just conflict avoidant. That's why she's calling a break, right? To say, no, I'm actually doing this because I have a value for us engaging well around a difficult topic. And so if it feels like the emotional temperature of the group reaches this point where we cannot hear each other anymore, I will call a pause, so that we can breathe, and then we can come back together and try again. And that gives you a chance as the facilitator to then figure out, what do I want to synthesize or name when we come back together? What do I want to offer as options going forward? I think I've experienced it be really effective. Again, not necessarily to get to quick solutions, but to help a group engage and feel like they can trust the process.
Andrea, I've also been doing some exploration of the nonviolent communication method.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, like that framework is resonating with me. And I was thinking about it, flipping it around instead of saying like, hey, this is how I'm feeling. I'm observing something. I feel this and I need this, to try to use it as a facilitation tool. And you could still start with like, hey, I'm observing this, but could you tell me if that's what's happening? And can you tell me what you're feeling? And then do you think we could talk about what you need? And then we work through that, like you're the counselor. And you can say like, okay, so you're saying I feel these things. Okay, now what do you need? What are your needs right now? And then once you've gone through that and they feel like heard, then you could be ready for the part of the conversation where you could say, okay, well, you know, I also have some needs too. And would you be willing to, and then try to find that place to thread the needle that would try to meet both people's needs.
Yeah. That's so great, Katie. I think I really love that framework as well. And I think it can be really effective in group settings, to turn it around the way you're talking about, because, similar to values, like those needs are operating below the surface and we're not always able to identify, and we're reacting out of that unmet need, right? Or reacting out of, for some people it's like, oh, that need hasn't been met my whole life. So that's a trigger, right? And so this is how I react in a group setting. So if you can help people connect with that and be able to learn to articulate and how to ask, and then that all relationships are negotiating around these needs, that's huge. I think that's a huge skill, both to use as a facilitator, but then think about the skills you're offering to the people you're navigating these conversations with. Think about how transformative it would be if we were all able to interact with other humans at that level, right? Or get to that level quickly and be able to, ask, not that we can always, again, similar to what Machi was describing, our response can't always be to meet that need exactly the way the other person is asking, but it often gives us a place to say, I can't do this, but I would be willing to do this. Like, how would that land with you? Would that meet it enough that we could move forward? So, yeah, I think that framework I'm glad that you're experimenting with that. Well, I want to reiterate again just what a pleasure it has been to be with you all tonight. Again, I love this content, thinking about how we help groups move forward. And I realize, whenever we're a smaller group, this was already going to be interactive, but then it sort of drives up the level of interaction if we're like, hey, there's a few of us, right? Like, hey, somebody want to share? So I just appreciate the level of engagement that you all brought, and the examples you shared, and thinking through how you would apply this. It was really fun to be with you tonight, and I'm excited in the future if our paths cross, to be able to hear how you're applying these things and what the impact is. So thank you. Thank you for being here and for interacting. And this was my thank you slide. Here it is. Thank you. And then I'll let Machu share again about the upcoming other workshops in this series.
Yeah, thank you all. It's a fantastic conversation. I know I certainly learned some new techniques and skills, and hope you did too. And thank you for just taking the time to share your stories with us all. We have a few trainings later this month, and so if any of these topics interest you, they're kind of designed to be sequential in a way to build your capacity to be effective in your communication, organizing your communities. So subscribe to our newsletter or go to southeastuplift.org/events to sign up for these events.
Our next event is this Thursday. It's on equity and accessibility community engagement. You can find, if you want a link, you can email me at alex@southeastuplift.org.